I'm so happy to welcome Beth Macy to Politics and Prose. Her journalism has appeared in the Roanoke Times, the Virginia Pilot, the New Yorker, and the New York Times, among many others. She's also the author of the book Factory Man. In tonight's book, Truevine, Truevine. Through thorough research, amazing interviews, and fantastic storytelling, Beth Macy brings what seems a surreal story to vivid life as American history and pieces together the mystery of what happened in Truevine in 1899. So please help me welcome Beth Macy to Politics and Prose.
Thank you, Candace. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. I think I know most of you. But thanks for you who came, who don't even know me. So awesome. This is my first event. The book just came out today. Yeah, Evelyn. Hello. Oh my God. Evelyn and I were roommates in 1986. What I thought I would do is I thought I would read 3 or 4 very short sections and stop in between to take questions, comments, compliments, whatever. So this is a story that I've known about almost my entire career. And I first heard it in 1989 when I moved to Roanoke. And I love that she mentioned, of all the New York things that I've published in, that she mentioned the Roanoke Times first. Because that Roanoke is really where my soul is. It's where my home has been since 1989. And as my great friend, the writer Brett Witter, once said, every place... Oh, wait, I'm going to get it wrong. He was talking about the importance of putting your stamp on a place. And he said, every place is as large as you make it, basically. Because I used to beat myself up that I stayed in a small city and didn't leave. But in staying there, I've been able to write both Factory Man, which grew out of my reporting at the Roanoke Times, and now Truevine, which also grew out of my reporting at the Roanoke Times. Did I say New York Times? I've never worked at the New York Times. So the story, as you can tell from the subtitle, which I have not yet memorized, one of the reviewers said, it's such a book, it has 2 subtitles, but it's 2 brothers, a kidnapping, and a mother's quest, a true story of the Jim Crow South. I really have to commit that to memory. And I didn't write it, the subtitle. But it's the first time I heard the story, it was presented to me as it was about George and Willie Muse, 2 albino African-American young boys who had been kidnapped and sold to the circus around 1899. So this first section is about kind of how I came to try to get the story. As a young journalist who'd arrived in Roanoke in 1989 to write feature stories for the Roanoke Times, I took 2 years to muster the nerve to mess with Nancy, and that's Nancy Saunders. She was the story's gatekeeper and the great niece of Willie and George Muse. A newspaper photographer had told me the bones of the kidnapping story based on rumors he'd heard growing up in Roanoke. He told me, it's the best story in town, but no one has been able to get it. By the time I poked my head into her tiny soul food restaurant with the idea of writing a story about her famous great-uncles, it was very clear that all personal details were going to be closely held, trickling out in dribs and drabs, and very much on Nancy's timeline. The first time I asked if I could interview Willie, he was then in his 90s, she pointed to a homemade sign on the goodie shop wall. A customer had stenciled the words in black block letters on a white painted board and given it to her as a gift. The sign said, "Sit down and shut up." Willie was not now, nor would he ever be, available for comment. So, hoping to generate some goodwill for a future story on our uncles, I wrote a feature about a restaurant, a place where the menu never changes and isn't even written down. You're just supposed to know. Legions of Black Roanokers could already recite the daily specials I would eventually commit to memory. Tuesday is spaghetti or lasagna, except every other Tuesday, which is pork chops. Wednesday is fish, and Thursday country fried steak. Friday is ribs, but you'd better come early because the ribs always sell out quickly. The line out front starts forming at noon, though lunch doesn't officially begin until 12:15 and not a minute before, and later if Nancy has to run home to check on Uncle Willie and finds him in the midst of a bad day. His favorite special was Spaghetti Tuesday. She also kept a painted rock on top of her cash register, a gift from her preschooler nephew, whom she helps raise. She was not above picking it up, presumably in jest, should a customer offend her. So when I returned for lunch 2 days after my story ran, because Rib Fridays were always my favorite, Nancy shook her finger at me, and it was clear I was not getting anything close to a pat on the back. Dot sat nearby peeling potatoes, watching the Young and the Restless, and cringing at what she knew her daughter was about to say to me. Nancy had been ready to send me packing the first time I walked in the restaurant and blithely inquired about her uncles, but soft-hearted Dot persuaded her to let me stay and do the restaurant feature. A Y&R fan in my youth, I actually saw the very first episode of Young and the Restless, my claim to fame. I bonded quickly with Dot over the characters and was helping peel potatoes in her kitchen before the episode was over, much to Nancy's chagrin. Victor Newman was a scoundrel, we both agreed. You know what your story did, Nancy barked? It brought out a bunch of crazy white people, that's all. Paying customers, I might have added, but she was in no mood for backtalk. She walked past me without further comment. She was leaving now to feed Willie and turn him in his bed, as she often did throughout the day, leaving the goodie shop as many as 5 or 6 times a shift. If Nancy Saunders had her way, her great-uncle's story would have stayed buried where she thought it belonged. The first time she heard it, she was just a child, and she found the whole tale embarrassing and painfully raw. The year was 1961. They had just retired, and black and white people alike wanted to know, were the light-skinned brothers black or white? Had they really been trapped in a cage and forced to eat raw meat? These men deserve respect, Nancy knew. They did not deserve the gawkers who came by their house at all hours, banging on the front door. And that was actually some of her very first memories, is of people banging on the door in the middle of the night. By the time I came on the scene, no one talked about savages or circus freak in front of Nancy, a sturdy woman with a no-frills afro, graying at the temples, whose skin was nearly as white as the chef's coat she wore to work. She baked bread every bit as good as her great-grandmother Harriet's ash cakes, and she was every bit as fierce. Even Red Sharif, who knew the family well, had never contemplated bringing the subject up with her. That is one exceptionally guarded family, he told me, advising baby steps. And he grew up around the corner from the Muse brothers, was a family friend, and now is a social sciences professor. And he's kind of a commenter throughout the book, as well as he was an advisor to me. You have to think of them as a tribe. They fall out with each other sometimes, but if you fall out with one of them, they will come roaring back at you like an army. It was 10 more years before Nancy warmed up enough to let me co-write a newspaper series about her uncles, and only after Willie Muse's death in 2001. She didn't reveal much, though. She invited my fellow reporter Jen McCaffrey, photographer Josh Meltzer, and me inside the Muse brothers' house exactly one time. She made reference to a family Bible that we were not permitted to view. And for years after the series ran, whenever I visited the restaurant, she hinted that there was so much more to the story than we had found out. She would call me Scoop in those moments. Other moments, when she thought I was being nosy, she called me Snoop. Our newspaper was the same one that had mocked her family's version of the kidnapping story decades before. It had looked the other way when city officials decimated 2 historic black neighborhoods in the name of mid-century progress via urban renewal, or as the black community in Roanoke called it, Negro removal. The newspaper cheered when the city knocked down hundreds of community homes and buildings, including the Muses family's Holiness Church. It refused to print wedding announcements for black brides until the mid-1970s because, as the wealthy white publisher reasoned, Roanoke had no black middle class. I myself had used a pair of pregnant black teens to illustrate a story about Roanoke's super high teen pregnancy rate in 1993, a story that went viral before that internet term existed, and made the girls the object of ridicule. Even Rush Limbaugh joined in with a rant. When the girls dropped out of school shortly after my story ran, it was devastating. Words linger and words matter, I learned, and it's not possible to predict the fallout they can have on a subject's life. It would take me 25 years, finally, to earn something nearing Nancy's trust, to convince her I wasn't one more candy peddler intent on exploiting her relatives for the color of their skin, or purely for my own financial benefit. In 2013, when I hit a snag updating the story of the pregnant teens more than 20 years after my explosive first story, it seemed fate that Shannon Huff, now a 37-year-old mother of 4, lived just around the corner from Nancy's Northwest Roanoke house. After some angry relatives tried to bully me into not running the story, physically threatening me and demanding a meeting with my newspaper bosses, Nancy reassured me, "You don't need their permission to do the story, just like you don't really need mine to write your book. Not really, you don't." And yet, months earlier, her permission is exactly what I sought. On the eve of publishing my first book, about a third-generation factory owner who had battled Chinese imports to save his company, I had given her an advanced reading copy of Factory Man, dog-earing a chapter on race relations I'd found particularly hard to write. It detailed decades of mistreatment of black furniture workers and the sexual harassment of black domestic workers who often resorted to wearing 2 girdles at the same time as a defense against their boss's groping hands and outright rape. "It's been that way down through history," Nancy told me. "A friend of my mom's, she'd be vacuuming down the steps on a housekeeping job, and the husband would be feeling her up from behind. My mom had to fill in for her one day, and so she told the man first thing, 'Don't make me open up your chest.' By which Dot Brown meant with the tip of my knife." Nancy and I had come a long way from the days of sit down and shut up. Still, it was by no means a gimme when I called her in November 2013, asking for her blessing to pursue her uncle's story as a book. She was in her mid-60s and recently retired after closing the goodie shop. I wanted her help delving into the family story, as well as connecting with distant Muse relatives, including one albino Muse still living in Truevine. "I'll think about it," Nancy said. And the message was clear. I was not to call back. She would call me. So that was November 11th, and I wrote it down on my calendar because I wanted to see how long it took her to call me back. And Thanksgiving came, then December came, and then Christmas. And I wrote her a Christmas card, and I said, "P.S. my phone number is." So more than 6 weeks later, she really enjoyed making me wait. She finally called. "I waited so I could give it to you as a present," she said. It was Christmas morning. Nancy had decided to let me write her uncle's story with her help and blessing, but on one condition. She said, "No matter what you find out or what your research turns out, you have to remember that in the end, they came out on top." I knew the story's ending, I assured her. I'd already interviewed several people, nurses and doctors, neighbors and lawyers, all of whom described the late life care she'd given her uncles as impeccable, extraordinary. I was less certain about who had forced them into servitude in the first place, about their struggle to have their humanity acknowledged and their work compensated. How exactly, during the harshest years of Jim Crow, had they managed to escape? So that's the beginning of a chapter 1 called Sit Down and Shut Up. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Willie Muse died in 2001. He was 108. Yeah. He was on no medication. He was the healthiest man. Marcella.
If you could use the mic,
I can repeat the question, too, if that's easier.
I guess I'm sort of curious because there's that long period from when you first approach her to when she gives you permission, and I can get a bit of a sense of how she's changed. I wonder how you changed as a journalist in that time from the person who maybe just came in to ask about the most personal story in her life.
Yeah. Well, I hope I got better. In the beginning, like when I wrote that Pregnant and Proud story, and I should say that wasn't a terrible story. It was part, Madeline was at the newspaper when it ran. It was part 2 of a 10-part series that ran over the course of 10 months. And it was a story about the sociology of teen pregnancy. It ran alone. It ran with a picture of them looking really happy and a quote underneath that said, "I knew," and it was about these 2 women best friends, 2 young women best friends. And it really was devastating, the fallout. We had to hire extra people to come in and answer at the newspaper, the telephones, and then a month or 2 later, I learned that they had dropped out of school, and there were letters to the editor criticizing me every day for about a month, maybe. Some people said I had glamorized teen pregnancy because I just let them tell their story. I mean, I had experts quoted too. I didn't judge it. I thought it was quite poignant in the end, especially. And I was really kind of stunned by the reaction. And when I was able to get the story 20 years later of one of them, the other one was the one the family didn't want the story. But actually, it wasn't as devastating to her as I had thought, I had imagined. But I think I got better. I think of that now as almost like drive-by anecdote writing. I didn't spend enough time with them. I think I met with them twice. When I did the update story on Shannon, I spent like 2 weeks with her. I mean, I really knew her. I knew her kids. I knew their desires, their fears. And I think I got better at that. I think I got better at writing, and I think I got better at putting in things into context. I didn't understand how hard their lives were, how chaotic their lives were at home the first time, until later when they were willing to tell me what life had been like for them. So that's a really good question, as usual. Any other questions before I move on?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
Do you think the was she a cousin or a niece, the woman that was telling you?
She's the great niece, and she's the caregiver, and she grew up in the house that they owned.
Do you think she would have been more willing to tell the story had the journalist been black?
I don't know. A black peonage researcher approached her about 5 years ago, and she wasn't even. She was writing a book about peonage, and she wanted to go see Willie Muse's grave, which is, it's in a public cemetery. And the grave manager, the woman came into the cemetery office, and she called Nancy because she knew how protective Nancy was of them and of their story. And she said, "Nancy, can I show her Willie's grave?" And she said, "Nope." And she wouldn't talk to her on the phone when she called. And she told me that she'd let me do the story eventually. I said, "How about letting me interview him now and holding the story?" She said, "Nope, you're too curious." She just, "I don't trust you." And I said, "Well, if I told you that, I wouldn't have done it." She said, "Yeah, but maybe your bosses would have made you, And so, I was young. I didn't have that much power at the newspaper at the time. I mean, she might be right about that. She tends to be right about most things, I've learned. Thank you. So the next section I was going to read from is a bit about my process. So this is a story that I almost didn't want to write. In fact, my editor and his boss at Little Brown thought, how is she going to be able to find out what really happened over 100 years ago? So there are a lot of holes. A lot of it is just there are a lot of documentation holes because of systematic racism. I mean, they don't know who their enslaved ancestors were because they were nameless in the census documents recorded by age and price value. And then later, when they weren't slaves, their names were often misrecorded, possibly due to illiteracy, but probably just due to careless senseless census taking. And anytime they were reported on, they were always mocked, always. So you couldn't really trust that either. I had to sort of go another layer back and talk about the context in which they were reported on. I also talked to lots of experts. I talked to social historians, circus experts. I talked to costume, because I found photographs, and that was some of the most incontrovertible evidence, because you can't spin a photograph. I mean, you can sort of, but I could take an old picture that I found, send it to a historic costume expert. He would blow it up, and he would tell me what he saw, and it was so much more than I would see. So I tried to do that with every little piece of really solid evidence. But the reality of this story, which I think is a lot more about Jim Crow America than it is about the circus, which I honestly am not as interested in, I think is in the gritty details, in the innumerable microaggressions that people from Truevine, which was a sharecropping community, experienced. And the family moves in the 19 teens, when at a time when they still don't know where the brothers are, moves to Roanoke, the city I live in now. And it had been a very booming city, but it was also a very hard place to be an African American. There had been a lynching in 1893. There had been incidences in the early aughts that were very, very traumatic. And then there was codified racism to the point where you could only live on certain blocks if you were black, in addition to all the other Jim Crow restrictions. It was actually written into the city code. And but I think the story bubbles the most when I'm able to talk to older people who can recall not just separate water fountains and separate schools, but the gritty details of life, what life was like during Jim Crow. So this is a little section where I talk about how I learned about Truevine. To understand the world of the Muse brothers came from, I talked to African Americans who have stayed in and around Truevine, some out of commitment to the home they love, and others because they have no viable alternative. All had the Muse name tucked somewhere in their family tree, though those trees are marked by holes and missing limbs. In a culture where census takers didn't bother recording the names of slaves, the first black muses to enter the public record are noted only as property, documented by gender, age, and dollar value. Most of the people you talk to in Truevine have no idea where their slave ancestors actually toiled, though it was likely nearby. Slavery in the American South, as Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson has written, decimated the black family unit of the 1800s, and it still plays a lingering role in black poverty and the relatively large numbers of families headed by single mothers today. As retired Franklin County Library genealogist Diane Hayes, who is African American, explained it, slavery was so painful that black families, like Holocaust victims, didn't talk about what happened for a long time. Lots of times the families would be split up so badly, sold off when their owners died, or given away as gifts when someone in the white family got married, that people don't know the names of their ancestors. Before the publication of Alex Haley's Roots in 1976, slavery remained such a taboo subject among blacks that when mid-century museum workers at Colonial Williamsburg tried to introduce a recording about slavery into an early interpretive program, the tape was repeatedly sabotaged by the black maintenance staff. Even then, it was still too raw, still too soon. The stories flow more easily now about brutal work conditions that didn't vary much from the time of emancipation to the American Civil Rights Movement. Without fail, from the wealthiest black entrepreneur to the retiree getting by on food stamps, the opportunity afforded Franklin County blacks throughout the first half of the 20th century echoed Booker T. Washington, who lived there for a time. It echoed his sentiment from 1865. He said, "To get into a schoolhouse and study this way would be about the same as getting into paradise." Most children of sharecroppers didn't go to school during the harvest, a period extending from August to December. They were too busy wiring tobacco leaves onto sticks, hanging them from rafters to dry. When their stomachs began to rumble, they were told to chew a leaf or two as an appetite suppressant. Quote, "In the fall, you only went to school when it rained or snowed," said Janet Johnson, 71, who'd been among the last generation in her family to work tobacco. She recalled dropping out of Truevine School in the 6th grade when she got tired of watching the white farmers' children go to school, while she and her siblings stayed home and worked the crop. Her mother, 98-year-old Mabel Pullen, she just turned 100, hadn't gone to school at all. Mabel didn't learn to read until she was in her 70s when she took a few night classes run by the county's adult education program. Her husband, Charles, never did learn to read. The Pullens live in Sontag, not far from Truevine, in a tar-papered bungalow heated by wood and supplemented by a pungent kerosene space heater. Mabel was 97 when we first met in 2013, hard of hearing but still sharp. I had met her daughter quite by chance while working on a newspaper article about proposed cuts to the food stamp program. Janet, who retired when the furniture factory where she worked in her early 60s closed, was picking up a box of food from a nearby food pantry to share with her parents. Charles and Mabel qualified for food stamps but refused to apply because, as Janet put it, "You talk about pride." To supplement their Social Security benefits, the extended family raised chickens, canned apples and tomatoes, and shared a plot of mustard greens, their salad patch, they call it. in the yard between their cluster of modest trailers and homes. By the time I returned to ask about sharecropping in Franklin County, it was almost a year later. Janet agreed to introduce me to people from Truevine, including some muses who still lived in the area. She was descended from people I later pieced together who crossed paths with Harriet Muse's husband, Cabell. As a child, she had heard that the circus had kidnapped the brothers right from under their mother's nose, but details were scant. She'd thought about them often over the years, with pity for their trauma, but with a touch of longing, too. Only in a place like Truevine, she thought, could the notion of being kidnapped seem almost like an opportunity. Shall I go on? Do we have any comments or questions? Okay. So when I first got onto this story, there was this nosy mailman named Randy Abbott. I probably shouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that if he wasn't here, but I just said it, didn't I? And he delivered mail in the neighborhood where the Muse family lived in the teens and 20s and 30s. And he was fascinated by this story. And he would interview everyone that might have had a memory of George and Willie. He would just interview them, and then he'd go write them down on little pieces of like postal delivery notices. And he had collected all these things, and he shared them with me. Well, Nancy couldn't stand him. She thought he was the nosiest man in the world. And but about 6 months ago, he called me, and the book wasn't yet, like, it was copy edited, but I could still make a few little changes. And he called, and there was this mystery of who exactly was their father. And he actually found evidence that led me to finally figure out who their father was, because I told you that the census takers often didn't record their names. He found the family living in the neighborhood called Jordan's Alley, which is all over this book. He found them living in 1920, filed in the census as Mules, M-U-L-E-S. And he found all their names were there except for George and Willie's. It was the children, and it was clear Harriet Cabell and the other children. And Harriet's former mother-in-law, America Cook. And so I was able to track down Mr. Cook with not full certainty, but I got a little piece of it. And it was so exciting because I had first learned about him in another document, and then to see that, she was actually, he was passed away, but his mother was still living with her, and that sort of like helped me buttress that even. So I got to give it to the nosy mailman. He went through all those, because I wouldn't, you don't think to look that way. But as I was looking for more information on the Cook family, and if anybody remembered, I thought, well, this is the lesson in journalism. You always go back another time. I'd driven around Jordan's Alley with 10 different people. I mean, I drive it through it every day. It's in between downtown and my neighborhood, so I drive through it all the time. I've driven through it with 80-year-olds, 90-year-olds, centenarians, trying to bring that world to life. And I thought, I'll go back one time and see if the name Cook jostles any memories. And somebody said, you ought to go visit Walter at Boxy Swedish. Well, we know Walter because he used to fix our 1990 Volvo that we just sold a year ago. And Walter said, well, you ought to go see so-and-so on Roar Avenue. And so I went to see so-and-so on Roar Avenue. He knew everybody in town who was African-American over the age of 60 knows the story of Eco and Iko, as they call them. That was their circus, their most common stage name. Some of them know them as George and Willie, but most African Americans grew up with it as sort of a cautionary tale. If you were going out to the circus or the festival or the fair, your mother would tell you, y'all stick together or you might get snatched up like Eco and Iko. And some kids knew it happened because they knew the family. Other kids thought it was made up. But George died in 1971, Willie died in 2001. The people in the neighborhood knew Willie was still there, and some people were afraid of him. Kind of like a Boo Radley character, because they didn't go out much because they were mistreated when they went out and ogled and pointed at, especially in the early years. One time they were walking through a park, and someone called the police and said there were wild men on the loose in Washington Park. And so, the family brought people into their house to cut their hair instead of taking them out to the barber shop. And they had this wonderful doctor who did house calls at the end of his life. And then a podiatrist would come to the house and clip his toenails. I mean, he just had this amazing way with people. People who cared for him loved him. So the car mechanic sends me to the other old guy, and he says, who you really need to go meet is J. Harry Woody, who lives down the street from me on Roar Avenue. He's 94, he's bedbound, but he's sharp as a tack. And so I said to my editor, I've got a new thread in the book. Stop the presses. Like, let me go find out what I can find. He said, you've got 2 more weeks. So and the reason I wanted to talk to Mr. Woody, because the neighbor had said, I think he's from Franklin County. So not only was he from Franklin County, he was from Truevine, and he lived in Jordan's Alley. So I knew this was going to be good. So we talk about the cooks. He's not so helpful there, but he's helpful in other ways. And so I'm interviewing him. He's lost a leg. He lives in kind of the living room in a bed. They have caregivers. His wife is able to get up and move around. He's delightful. He's sharp as a tack. But he sort of spends most of his time in a hospital bed in the living room. Hanging on his bedroom wall, an incomplete family document still occupies the mind of 94-year-old J. Harry Woody, a Truevine native who lives in a 4-square home in Roanoke's West End. It's his grandparents' 1878 marriage license. Where the young couple's parents' names are listed, there's a single line where the groom's father's name is intentionally blank, as if he were immaculately conceived. Quote, my great-grandfather was a white man, Woody told me, recounting the story his father told him. See, the landowner would have sex with his black maid and then tell her that she should feel honored that a white man would want her, he said, exclaiming from his living room hospital bed. It was happening from slavery all the way down to when I was growing up in the 1930s, he added. They'd force all the maids, and they had kids of all different colors. As proof, he points to the thin skin of his forearm, the color of coffee with full-fat cream. And didn't none of them ever claim their children, he added, his eyes blazing, more than a century later, with the indignity of his own grandfather's fatherlessness. They were ashamed to claim their children, but they weren't ashamed to force sex on the maids. I wondered aloud how the white children living nearby identified him, like Janet Johnson from Truevine and Mr. A.J. Reeves, now 102, just came to my book launch party on Sunday night. He remembered walking miles to Truevine School, 60 kids and 1 teacher in a single room, while the white kids took county-furnished buses and taunted the black walkers along the way. I wondered what they called him. They called me the N-word, he said, and he scoffed. Then he changed the subject, staring at a pre-publication postcard I'd given him that featured the cover of this book. Mr. Woody positively lit up, reading the tobacco field on the cover like he was divining tea leaves, and this is what he saw. Looks just like tobaccos from the 30s, he said, pointing to the yellow-tinged leaves. Immature plants, still months away from harvest. The yellowed leaves meant that the farmer who planted the crop was poor, probably black, he said. Back when blacks wasn't able to buy fertilizer because they didn't have the money to pay for it. You can tell that because the leaves are turning yellow before they got to be full size. He could tell all that from just the picture on the cover of the book. He wanted to know when this book would be for sale. Publication was still more than 6 months away. He said younger people, black and white, needed to understand the harsh realities of their ancestors. They think we're lying. They say that was then, this is now. They think everything was roses, but ain't nobody making any of it up. I'd been sitting at his bedside for going on 2 hours. It was a crisp April morning. He'd ended the interview twice already, saying he was tired. Then he kept telling stories when I stood up to go. Lynn.
Thank you. So, in researching this and getting into this story, do you have any insights about our race relations now and the tensions? Did you have any kind of aha moments, either why we're in the state of affairs we are, or a way how to move out of this?
Yeah, can we come back to that at the end? Because I think that'd be a really good discussion that we could all get into at the end. I kind of end with that idea.
Pondering it the whole time.
No, I know. I'm pondering it too, and I would love to hear everybody's thoughts on that. Yeah, she was saying what have I learned about what's relevant about my book basically to race relations today, and there's the epilogue I think addresses that. I try to address it without sounding like I'm this white lady that knows everything in the world about discrimination, which I do not. So this is a story. This is the last section I'll read, although I might read a little bit from the epilogue, maybe. This is a story about a mother who was illiterate. And in 1927, her children have been gone for 13 years. Her name is Harriet Muse. She and Nancy are the heroes of the book. So it's 1927 in Roanoke, Virginia. Roanoke has the largest KKK clavern in the state. A year earlier, a KKK parade march down Roanoke, down Campbell Avenue, which is like our main street, through the market area, and down Jefferson Avenue to the fairgrounds where they had a big rally. So the next scene, the pinnacle moment actually happens at the same fairgrounds. The idea, when it first came to Harriet Muse, was so bold it was practically suicidal. She could have been arrested. She could have been killed. Harriet Muse could not have read the advanced press Dexter Fellows had spoon-fed and finagled Roanoke Times reporters into writing in October 1927. So he was like their press man, their advanced guy, Dexter Fellows. The world's largest circus is here, the newspaper trumpeted in a preview story about the upcoming spectacle of 4 locomotives, 100 rail cars, 1,600 people, 5 rings, 6 stages, and the circus's most famous star of the moment, a special guest albino elephant from Burma. It was the first time the combined RB and BB shows had ever played Roanoke, and Ringling's advance team had been busy placing newspaper ads in the weeks leading up to the performance. The billing crew plastered handbills for the 2 shows all over the city ahead of time, and the adjusters secured the usual permits. The big one, and that was one of the nicknames of Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey, the big one had just recently grown from a 4-ring to a 5-ring affair. At the Roanoke Fairgrounds, there was no whites only sign posted, but this was the same venue where the KKK rallied, and blacks across the South already knew they could not just wander the showgrounds at will. In Louisiana, for instance, officials had gone to the trouble of mandating racially separate ticket booths and entrances and exits, down to the declaration that black and white accommodations had to be 25 feet apart. While carnivals performing week-long stays typically set aside a midweek day as Colored Day or Black Achievement Day, circuses that played just one day afforded no such access. Blacks arriving at a one-day event such as the 1927 Roanoke show would have had to view the big top performers from a restricted area in the back of the tent, the back-end blues, as show people call it. By the fall of 1927, the Ringling Caravan was finishing up its late-season swing through the southern states, having already looped through Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Taylor Gordon, John Ringling was sort of the grand poobah brother. He ran it for most of the time. Taylor Gordon was John Ringling's longtime chauffeur. He described what it was like for black circus workers from the North to journey through the land of Jim Crow. The shock of seeing signs at his Pullman car window that read, "N-words and dogs not allowed," and of learning to introduce himself to white Southerners as Mr. Ringling's N-word to stave off criticism and attacks. Gordon was wisely defensive. In 1927, a lynch mob had gathered outside a circus tent in Duluth, Minnesota, declaring that 3 black workers for the John Robinson Circus had raped a white girl. Though the young woman's doctors found no physical evidence of rape, the mob hanged the men anyway in one of the most notorious events in American circus history. And yet consider, even those heinous events had not been held in locales where the city's chief prosecutor was the founder of the largest Klan organization in the state. Indeed, the biggest threat of danger on this day was not to any circus employee, and it had nothing to do with the usual unpredictability of Circus Day, that rare moment when country and city life converge, when preachers got to see the wonders of God's animal creations, but also rubbed elbows with some of the drunkest, meanest people in town. When middle-class farmers and townsfolks were put within eyeshot of educational but naughty hoochie-coochie strip shows, a.k.a. the Cooch Show. No, the gravest danger that day was to Harriet Muse, who'd made her way from the clapboard shack on 10.5 Street through the downtown and to the fairgrounds in suburban South Roanoke late that afternoon, probably by streetcar. For decades, Roanokers would speculate about how she learned that her long-lost sons were playing that day in the circus. Maybe a neighbor had seen them performing earlier in the day and sent word. Maybe one of the families Harriet did laundry for casually mentioned noticing one of the posters plastered all over town. Maybe one of her other children, now grown, heard it through the Jordan's Alley grapevine. Her granddaughter, Dorothy, Nancy's mother, Dot, she's the Young and the Restless, watch her with me, had been born, she had just been born a week before, to Annie Bell and Herbert Saunders on October 4th, just 10 days earlier. That little girl would grow up hearing a lot about Harriet's brave actions that day. Discussed at every family reunion and every Sunday potluck, the story would become the Muse's single most vivid piece of lore, passed down like the tale of a grandfather's war heroics, or a cousin's brief brush with notoriety, or the meeting of the immigrant great-grandparents when the man saves a pretty lady from stepping on a snake. After all those years of searching and worrying, Harriet woke up the morning of October 14th with an absolute certainty of where she should go. Her husband would be of no help to her. That was nothing new. The last thing he thought they needed now was more mouths to feed. Harriet was entirely alone, but she was convinced, and she was unflinching. Quote, "It came to her as she was sleeping," Dodd told me in a 2001 interview. She saw it in a dream. Go to the circus. I don't want to give it all away. So that was all I was going to read. Does anybody have any other comments on that section in particular? Evelyn?
Not that particular section. But you know, as you're talking and reading, and I was thinking, I mean, you must feel that this is some kind of like freeze frame of a lot of different things that you want to look at, and primarily, you know, Truevine, and in terms of like Jim Crow South, and then looking and seeing how it started and how it's impacted people's lives, and then how it's maybe manifesting now.
Mm-hmm.
Like why, I mean, you obviously love the story, and I know you've been told the story is a fantastic story, like,
My whole career, really. There's almost a time when I can't remember not thinking about it. And so
but why in I mean, I know like the image of these two albino African Americans and the circus,
Mhm.
but it almost sounds like a genetic, you know, who's related to who, you spend a lot of time with that.
Mhm.
Like, was there any kind of DNA test or anything like that?
Mhm.
Or, I mean, what, you know, I just, in terms of your sleuthing, is it a particular story, it's just this particular story and how it is a universal story?
I just wanted to, the story is such a strange tale.
Yeah.
I wanted to put it in context. I wanted to humanize them. They had never been humanized. They were called the Ecuadorian cannibals, Darwin's missing links, the monkey men.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring these names that weren't even their names. I wanted to make them George and Willie Muse. And by doing that, I wanted to put the fullness of their story from their family, the people that led up to them, as far as I could figure out, to the people I knew when I first landed in Roanoke, to what's happening today. And I do that through like a younger, the last voice of the family really to speak, other than Nancy, is an 18-year-old who grew up like kind of listening to them tell stories, or listening to Willie. George was passed away. And I hoped, I didn't know, I mean, I started working on this in 2013. I hoped that it would be a story that would reflect larger concerns if it could be put in the proper context, which it had never been. So I had this cheat sheet when I went on Fresh Air the other day that had all the media, like the way they were reported on. So in 1927, it was clear they never interviewed. After this thing happened, Harriet gets them back. they never asked Harriet. They quoted her in dialect, but it was very clear that they never actually talked to her. And don't think it's just the Southern papers, because the New York Times and the New Yorker reported on it too when they went back the following year. The New Yorker, in a Talk of the Town essay, said they came back to the circus. This time they were being paid, finally, because the fried chicken had given out in Roanoke. The New York Times put in a headline, Eco and Iko are happy. And then later in the story, it said, they're happy now because finally, it said 10 years, it was actually more than that. After 10 years, they finally have the permission of their parents to be out traveling with the circus. There was no mention of the trafficking, which probably wasn't even a word then. There was no mention of anything that had gone, no mention of the lawsuit. So that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to tell that deeper story and just hope that it would do what I always hope journalism helps readers connect one another, if only for a moment. I think like newspapers especially should be like the glue of their community. I always wanted to tell stories about people who didn't live in my neighborhood and didn't live in my zip code, so that other people would get to know one another, because blacks were not covered unless they had committed a crime. And so I just hope people would find understanding and always empathy. That was my real goal. Sir?
My friend Jim Hirschman, who teaches at Georgetown, told me before the campaign began that if you wanted to read one book on industrialization and globalization, Factory Man was the book to read.
Oh, that's very kind.
What was your cooperation with the remaining Ringlings, and does Kenneth Feld, the current owner of Ringling Brothers, have any reaction to your book?
I have not heard. The people that owned Ringling then were the Ringling family members themselves.
They have a big museum, of course, down in.
Yeah, they have a big museum. The museum was very cooperative. The John and Mabel Ringling Museum. Some of the best photos in the insert, including the first known photo of them, was unearthed by one of their archivists. And it's this photo, and it's the photo I mentioned earlier. If you have the book, there's actually two photo inserts. It's like page 4 of the first photo insert. So the Ringling Museum unearthed that photograph for me, and then I was able to, that's the one I sent to the historic costume person who works at the College of Charleston and said, historic menswear is my passion. I mean, that's the great thing about anything. Like, that was the truth in Factory Man. Like, there's always an expert you can call up. So are you a circus historian?
Oh, no, I'm just a friend of the teacher who mentioned your book. That's
okay. But there are like deep niche circus experts people out there. There are people who specialize in souvenir rings of Irish giants. Not giants, Irish giants. There are people who specialized in very specific, there are a lot of collectors, and they were very helpful to me. There was a guy, he came to my book launch party all the way from Toronto on Sunday, and his name's Al, and he's like a total Al. And he actually ran away with the circus in the mid-1960s. His name's Al Stencil. His mother said, no, we can't let him go. And his father said, oh, he'll be back. Well, he never came back. And he eventually bought his own circus, a Canadian circus, and traveled with the circus. But Al was just like a font of information. And he knew, like, if he didn't know the answer to something about the sideshow, he knew who to call. So there's the collector in Silver Spring, Maryland, named Warren Raymond, who was super helpful and gave me some of the pictures. And but one of my favorite quotes in the book is Al. We're trying to track down one of their last carnival managers. They were with carnivals in the 50s and early 60s. And we thought this guy in Philadelphia had the last remaining, perhaps, souvenirs from that era of their career. And so Al said, call Philadelphia Eddie's Tattoos. Call Philadelphia Eddie's Tattoo and ask for Furry Couch and tell him I sent you. I called like 4 times. Furry never called me back. I don't know if I answered your question.
Circuses were huge.
Huge, yeah.
Enterprises back then.
Yeah, so they were the number one form of entertainment from 1840 to 1940. before radio was big, before television, movies, before professional sports were really huge. Circuses were huge. And during the time when Bassett Furniture and all those furniture makers are the country's industrializing in the early 1900s, it was some family's first form of like a mini vacation. You would wait until the circus came to your town, and that would be your vacation. You would go, you'd walk 4 blocks and go see this spectacle of acts and performers, and the sideshow was part of that. And so thank you. Yeah. Yes, Kristen.
So I see from the photo insert that you did some research at the Library of Virginia.
Oh, yes, I
Court
did.
documents. I proudly serve on the board there. So
Thank you,
was
Library of
wondering-
Virginia.
Yes, we love LUV or LOV. So there's the oral tradition of the stories of the ancestors. You have photographs, and you checked census data. But tell me again more about like the official records in the government records that perhaps filled out the story. Because right here you have some court papers, and census data was so-so.
Right.
But maybe you could just elaborate on that.
Sure. There's a beautiful picture of, well, it's not beautiful. I took it. It's not great, but it's the Library of Virginia said, oh, we have a box of information on that case. And so, like, I asked my friend if I could stay in her spare bedroom. I'm going to spend a couple days going through this box. And they wheel it out on a cart, and it's a box, and there's, like, 2 things in it. It was so disappointing. And it was basically the original petition for damages. So Harriet Muse gets her sons back. It was a big fight just to get them home that day in October 1927. It was a Friday. On Monday morning, she found a young, ambitious lawyer, a white man named Warren Messick, who went on to become kind of a famous in all over Virginia litigator. He was said to move his own self to tears during his own closing remarks. And they file a lawsuit against the greatest show on earth. So that's the original, and you see his name, T.W. Messick, right there. That's him. So it was cool to see the original document because I had seen a copy of it already. So, but sorry, LVA, it wasn't a huge, but they were very nice. Yeah. And so there was that lawsuit, and we knew about that when we wrote about the story in 2001 after Willie Muse died. What we didn't know about was this other, much more complicated and protracted lawsuit that Harriet had to file in 1936. And why did she have to file it? Well, because their longtime manager, who was really the only person they ever said anything bad about, they hated him. Ringling started paying them. And then their manager said, oh, we're going to move them to another show so I can start pocketing the money again. So suddenly the checks stopped coming. And then he would switch it when somebody get on to him, then he'd switch another show. And so the great mystery was, like, how did she end up getting him paid? And she actually, this lawsuit that I was able to find, much of it misfiled in the annex of the Roanoke City Courthouse, with the thanks of the clerk of court in Roanoke, who was the first African-American clerk of court. She was so determined to find that file for me. And there's this great scene where she's finally found it, and she's giving it to me. And we're standing in front of the portrait of Governor Lindsay Almond, and then she just tells me the story about how massive resistance and how she grew up in Farmville, Virginia, and she wasn't able to go to school for 5 years because of the man in the portrait. And so, that's right, Kristen Green's book. I actually had a galley copy. I gave it to her at the time, and she couldn't read it. It was too raw. So I take the moment when an exchange happens that I think sheds light on either history or what's going on now. I digress. I include myself in I say what, I mean, otherwise how would you have known that, how, but so I put myself in the book. I hope where it sheds light on what's going on. And but that lawsuit was a great trove. It gave me a lot more information, because what happened is she had another lawyer declare them incompetent, basically, which sounds terrible, but it allowed the court to be involved, so that when Candy Shelton then tried to blow the show, as was circus lingo, move him to another circus, then the circus checks would stop coming, or the checks would come and they would bounce. The lawyer, who was getting a little cut, of course, all the people were getting their own little piece, he would go find him, or he would hire missing persons detectives, Pinkerton detectives, and they were everywhere. They were Vancouver to, they were in Washington D.C. once. They were in Winston-Salem. They were Venezuela. They were all over, and I couldn't figure out how this mousy lawyer, because I'd learned everything I could learn about this lawyer, who was super interesting. He had this tick, and he was always putting his hand through his hair, and Bonnie knows I like to write about the interesting lawyers. She's in Factory Man. Is Joe Dorn here? Dang it.
Fishing.
Yeah, fishing. He blew me off for fishing. So this lawyer, who was Wilbur Austin, was able to get the family paid, and because he was able to do that, and I explained how, and it was quite a mystery, and through these documents that Brenda found for me, shed a lot of light on it. And because they were able to finally get paid every time for the rest of their career, when they retired in 1961, their family had bought a nice 4-square house for them. It was paid off, and their aunts and their sister, who was Nancy's grandmother and Nancy's mom, and Nancy took care of them for the rest of their life. And so it was quite something, but it was complicated. Like everything, once you dig deep enough, it's complicated. Yes, Bonnie.
So,
I have really packed the audience, people.
so you had this story percolating for 25 years, and in the last 5 years, you get permission to really put this story together for Nancy, and put all these pieces together, and you see it. Don't you really regret that you didn't ever get to talk to Willie before he died in 2000?
Yeah, people have asked me that.
It's making me sad that you never got to talk.
People said, well, what would you ask him if you saw him? Everyone that talks about him, it's almost like they're talking about a Christ figure. I mean, everybody talks about him who knew him really well with such reverence. He went from being a cautionary tale to a wise elder, so that by the end, when he's 105 and he's 106, he's giving his nurses who come to the house to take care of him advice. He can tell in their voice, he's blind by then, he can tell in their voice that they've had a bad day, and he becomes this amazing person. And even the doctor, would love to go to see him, like when he was having a problem with his wife. Let's go see what Uncle Willie has to say about this. And so I would have loved to talk to him, obviously. I would love to just kind of soak up that reverence and see what that was like. I would also love to know what those early years were like on the road. But I never thought about she was so firm, and I just wish you could see her, because the Reggie Sharif, the professor I mentioned earlier, who I'm going to mess this up, Tom, so help me out if I forget. He introduced me at the book launch party the other night, and he said, Beth was the irresistible force, and Nancy was the immovable object. And you just wouldn't ever cross her. And we did a little book trailer before the book came out. She said, I'll give one interview. I said, well, CBS Sunday Morning might come do a story. She goes, I'll give one interview, and I'll give it to Tom. That's my husband. And so she tells the story about the first time she said, you came in and you just thought I was going to give you this story. And you said, why won't you? And honestly, I don't remember the first moment I went in. I remember the sign, sit down and shut up, because I wrote the story about the restaurant, and I can go back and read that story. But she remembers it like it was yesterday. She said, you came in and I said to myself, Scratch has met its match. I was Scratch and she was the match. And so it never occurred to me to I would never try to do that. It just wasn't on the list of possibilities. Yes, Evelyn.
So how did Nancy like the book?
Oh, great question. Can I read a little bit from the end? So I had
You can make this just the last because we're
Okay, sure. I had it was edited, but it hadn't been copy edited yet, and my editor said, and it ends with Willie Muse's death, and I knew all along that was going to be the end. And he read it, and he gave me like his overall feedback. He said, "Send you." I said, "Do you think it's finished?" Because like Factory Man, I thought the Factory Man would end with the big victorious moment. Something happened later that really I knew had to be the ending. I knew those dislocated workers had to have the last word. And so he said, I don't want to tell you what the epilogue is, but I think it needs an epilogue. And so I had given her the edited version of the book. Then I'm not quite finished. Like I hadn't even met Mr. Woody yet. And it hadn't been copy edited. And so I gave it to her for fact checking, just like I did John Bassett, the subject of Factory Man. She was much easier to deal with than John Bassett. She had like 6 changes. She did not scream me down. And so do I have like 5 minutes maybe? Okay. So I'll just read a little bit of the epilogue. The trains still pass by Jordan's Alley, their cars still brimming with coal, though the fuel in many of them is now destined for markets overseas. The ones that head south roll past the site of the old fairgrounds, the spot where an illiterate washerwoman, the daughter of slaves, managed to find and claim her long-gone sons, even though she was the wrong color in the wrong neighborhood on the wrong side of the law. Harriet Muse's bravery remains unmarked in Jordan's Alley, and it goes unrecognized here, just south of downtown, where the trains now parallel a 13-mile greenway path meant to connect the various Roanoke Valley communities, provide outdoor recreation, and in so doing attract new industry to the region to replace the waning influence of the railroad and of coal. Riding my bike on the Roanoke River Greenway path, I parallel the passing trains too. I pass dog walkers and runners, young and old, black and white. It's one of the rare places in Roanoke where the racial makeup actually reflects the diversity of the city's census count, down to the Immigrant Soccer League playing Sunday mornings across the street. My friend Zior, a refugee from Liberia, comes here to watch her sons play on those fields. She says, "We were never called black people before until we moved here." She tells me, tapping into Americans' innate and unconscious belief in the reality of race is unequivocal divider. Our history of categorizing human beings as immutably black or white before we even know their names. It's 1 year after Ferguson, 50 years after the Watts riots, 150 years since the end of the Civil War. In the past year, so this is dated 2015, 32 states have enforced new voter identification requirements that disproportionately disenfranchise poor and minority voters, and 26 unarmed black men have been fatally shot by police across the United States of America. Even Atticus Finch, it turns out, wasn't the progressive lawyer we thought he was. On the Greenway near the old fairgrounds and the new medical school, I ride over a freshly scrawled graffiti bomb on the asphalt. "Slavery is over," someone has spray painted. I think of Nancy's young cousin, the auburn-haired Erica Turner, when I see it. She's the 18-year-old. She's a freshman at ODU. She has cried, imagining the travails of her great-great-great Uncle Willie and his brother George. When she cries, she tells me, her hazel eyes turn green. She has albinism on both sides, but she isn't a person with albinism. A rising senior at a Roanoke County high school, this is 2015, she's one of a handful of African Americans, occasionally the only one in her advanced classes. When riots broke out in Baltimore her junior year, her classmates criticized the protesters and looters, asking, "What's the sense in them burning businesses? What does that prove?" The course was psychology, and Erica, one of 3 blacks in that class, pointed out that the riots were not happening in a vacuum. They were precipitated not only by police killings, but also by a government-sanctioned history of violence, discrimination, and injustice as old as the country itself. But this is a conversation that most white people, if suburban classrooms and Greenway graffiti are to be believed, do not wish to have. More than half of white Americans think the country spends too much time talking about race, while just 18% of black Americans do. In July 15, I'm driving Nancy to the cemetery where Willie Muse is buried. She tells me, this is after she's read the draft, she tells me she's inspired by my account of her great-grandmother's efforts to make the circus pay for her son's work. I lost track of how many times she had to take those circus men to court. And if she was like that back then with no education, just think what she might be like today. I mean, she was bad. Like, good, bad. There's just one real problem with the facts as I've assembled them, she says, and it's big. I do, quote, I do not and will not believe that Harriet let her children go off with the circus. As a mother, that was all she had to cling to, her children and her Christ. So that was mainly her only. There is evidence that suggests perhaps that Harriet let them go initially for pay. There is also evidence that suggests otherwise. And there's a story that Willie Muse himself told, which is that he was, he didn't use the word kidnap. He said we were stolen from a tobacco field. And somebody asked me the other day, what do you think, Beth? What do you think really happened? And I said, well, Willie himself said he was stolen. And, well, first of all, nobody had ever asked me that. My editor hadn't even asked me, what do you think happened? Which I thought was interesting. He was so worried in me getting the documentation right and getting so there's the beginning of the story when they're kidnapped or not kidnapped. And then very soon after, clearly they were trafficked and they were kidnapped again and again and again. But there is this very beginning narrative because she possibly let them go, but they were supposed to be returned to her just a few months later and they were not. And so we were so worried about getting that right that nobody had ever asked me. And Lynn Neary at NPR asked me. I said, oh, Lynn, nobody's ever asked me that. But the truth is, I think it's unknowable. I think it's the story. It's complicated. I think we'll never know what happened in that tobacco field. And I would never be one more person to not give Willie Muse a voice in this. If he says he was kidnapped, then he was kidnapped. It's just not my place to say. I lay out the evidence, and the reader, him or herself, can decide. Thank you very much for coming.